tan difícil de creer. Este tipo fue una vez la estrella de cine número uno.
For decades, Burt Reynolds was the face of Hollywood cool. The mustache, the grin, the easy charm that made him the biggest box office draw in the world for 6 straight years. Audiences thought they knew him. But there was a side of Burt Reynolds that almost nobody outside his inner circle ever saw. The side of him that lived in his home, not on a movie set. And when he passed away, the son he raised was suddenly thrust into headlines for a reason nobody expected. People assumed the worst. They assumed a broken family, a bitter falling out, a father who cut his boy off without a second thought. What actually happened was far more complicated and far more human than the tabloids let on. This is the real story of Burt Reynolds and the son who finally decided to speak the truth. Long before he was Burt Reynolds, movie star, he was just a kid named Buddy. He was born in February of 1936. And for most of his life, the public believed he'd come into the world in Waycross, Georgia. It wasn't until he published his memoir decades later that he admitted the truth. He was actually born in Lansing, Michigan, while his father was in the process of being drafted into the Army. His early childhood was anything but settled. The family moved from Michigan to Missouri. Then overseas commitments pulled his father to Europe, and young Burt bounced between relatives and rented homes with his mother and sister until the war ended. Eventually, the family put down roots in Riviera Beach, Florida, a small town on the state's southeastern coast. It was there that Buddy Reynolds became a local name, and where his father eventually became the town's police chief, a stern, no-nonsense man who ran his household the way he ran his precinct. Burt threw himself into sports. By high school, he was one of the best running backs in the state, a bruising athlete who caught the attention of college scouts across the South. He turned down offers from bigger programs to stay close to home and play for Florida State University. College football should have been the next step toward a pro career. Instead, it became the end of one dream and, unknowingly, the beginning of another. Burt was a punishing, versatile player in his freshman season. He ran, caught passes, returned kicks, and even picked off a pass on defense. But injuries piled up fast. A torn cartilage in his knee during a preseason workout put him under knife, and doctors held out hope he'd be back the following year. Then, only weeks after that surgery, 19-year-old Burt was nearly killed in a car crash on a Florida highway, colliding with a stalled truck whose driver fled the scene. He was left with internal injuries and a ruptured spleen, and it took him the better part of 2 years to recover enough to even consider stepping onto a football field again. When he finally did return, his body simply wasn't the same, and after a rough outing where teammates blamed him for a loss, he made the call himself. Football was over. It was almost by accident that Burt discovered acting. At Palm Beach Junior College, an English professor heard him read Shakespeare aloud in class and was so struck by his voice and presence that he pushed Burt to audition for a school play. Burt won the lead role and, to his own surprise, walked away with an award for it. That small trophy came with a scholarship to a summer theater program in New York. And suddenly the football star who thought his future had been stolen from him found something that felt just as thrilling: a stage, an audience, applause. New York wasn't glamorous for him at first. He worked odd jobs to get by, studied alongside future stars, and endured rejection after rejection, including one infamous screen test where a studio executive told him flatly that he looked too much like Marlon Brando to ever get cast. But another executive, watching that same tape, saw something different. Raw charisma that the camera simply couldn't ignore. That charisma would end up carrying him through television guest spots, a contract with a major studio, and finally, a string of leading roles that turned him into one of the biggest names in the business. By the early 1970s, Burt Reynolds was no longer just a working actor. He was becoming a phenomenon. His breakout dramatic role in a gritty backwoods thriller in 1972 proved he had real range, but it was a string of high-octane comedies and action films that followed which made him a household name. Car chases, easy one-liners, that unmistakable laugh. For the better part of a decade, nobody in Hollywood sold more tickets than Burt Reynolds. For 6 consecutive years, he was voted the #1 box office star in the world, a record he shared with very few others in the history of the industry. He wasn't content to just stand in front of the camera, either. He moved into directing, took creative control of several of his own films, and cultivated an image of a guy who did his own stunts, drove his own cars, and never took the business too seriously, even when it was making him one of the wealthiest actors alive. 2 decades later, after a career low, he reminded everyone exactly why he'd been a star in the first place with his searing dramatic performance as an aging adult film director, a role that brought him a wave of critical acclaim and award nominations he hadn't seen in years. Long before Quentin ever entered the picture, Burt's personal life was its own kind of roller coaster, one that tabloids followed almost as closely as his box office numbers. He married actress Judy Carney in the early 1960s, a union that lasted only a couple years before ending in divorce. Afterward came a long relationship with actress Miko Maima, and later a high-profile romance with television host and singer Dinah Shore, a woman 2 decades his senior, which raised eyebrows across Hollywood at the time, but lasted for several years regardless of the gossip. There was a brief, much-discussed relationship with country music star Tammy Wynette in the mid-1970s, but the pairing that truly captured the public's imagination was his years-long romance with actress Sally Field. The two were an on-again, off-again fixture of entertainment headlines for the better part of a decade, and even long after they'd gone their separate ways. Burt would describe her in later interviews as a great love of his life, a comment that made headlines all over again decades after they'd broken up. His marriage to Lonnie Anderson in 1988 was, in many ways, the union that mattered most in the long run, because it was during that marriage that he and Lonnie adopted Quentin. But the marriage itself was rocky almost from the start and eventually collapsed into one of the messier, more publicized celebrity divorces of the 1990s, complete with dueling lawsuits, custody arrangements, and a level of media attention that neither of them could really escape. It was, in hindsight, a strange and difficult backdrop for a young child to grow up against. 2 famous parents whose split played out in newspapers and on television long before Quentin was old enough to understand any of it. Behind the swagger, Burt carried a wound that never fully closed. His own father, the police chief, was a product of an older, harder generation, a man who provided for his family, but almost never expressed affection out loud. In interviews later in life, Burt would grow visibly emotional describing this. He recalled that his father simply couldn't bring himself to say the words, "I love you," not once, not even as Burt became one of the most famous men in the world. The closest he ever got was a single sentence, spoken once, that Burt held on to for the rest of his life. "I'm proud of you." To Burt, that sentence had to stand in for everything his father never said. Their relationship had genuine friction, not just emotional distance. Burt once told a story about being hauled into jail by his own father after getting into a fight with some men his dad had arrested. 3 days behind bars, a lesson delivered with handcuffs instead of words. When Burt eventually told his father he was leaving football behind to pursue acting, the response wasn't encouragement. It was closer to mockery. Burt never forgot the sting of that reaction, and he never forgot the quiet vow he made in response, that he would prove his father wrong, and that he would do it in some strange way for him. That childhood shaped every decision Burt made once he became a father himself. In 1988, he and his second wife, actress Lonnie Anderson, adopted a son they named Quentin. From the outside, Quentin grew up with every advantage: 2 famous, wealthy, successful parents, a beautiful home, a life most kids could only imagine. But Burt was determined that his son would never feel the silence he grew up with. Friends and interviewers who spent time around the 2 of them noticed it immediately. Burt hugged his son constantly, told him he loved him without hesitation, sometimes to the point where a young, embarrassed Quentin would cover his own face in mock protest. Burt didn't care. He'd laugh it off and do it again the next day. He said, more than once, that he simply refused to let his son grow up wondering whether his father loved him. It was the one thing about his own childhood he was determined never to repeat. That doesn't mean Quentin's childhood was simple. His parents' marriage collapsed when he was still young, and the divorce between Burt and Lonnie Anderson turned into one of the more public, bitter separations of that era. Headlines, custody arrangements, years of tension that played out in gossip columns. Quentin was caught in the middle of 2 famous people's very public unraveling, something no child, famous parents or not, finds easy to live through. As he grew older, Quentin made a choice that set him apart from a lot of children of celebrities. He stayed almost entirely out of the spotlight. He didn't chase reality television appearances or magazine profiles. Instead, He quietly built a career for himself behind the scenes in the film and production world, the same industry that had made his father famous, but from a position where nobody was watching him. Friends and family have described him as private, thoughtful, and fiercely protective of his own space. Someone who watched his parents live their entire lives under a microscope and decided early on that wasn't the life he wanted for himself. That instinct to stay quiet only deepened as his father aged. Burt's health began to decline noticeably in his final decade. He underwent back surgery, then a major heart procedure to repair several blocked arteries. Years of doing his own stunts had caught up with him too. Old injuries to his tailbone, his jaw, his back, all resurfacing with age. Through it all, Quentin remained close to his father, even as Burt's finances and personal life grew increasingly turbulent. At his peak, Burt was earning astonishing sums, reportedly pulling in millions of dollars a year during the height of his box office run. But making money and managing it, it turned out, were two very different skills. He sank huge amounts into business ventures outside of acting, restaurant chains, real estate, other side projects, several of which failed and cost him personally because he financed them under his own name rather than through a company that could have shielded him. Add in a costly, drawn-out divorce and a lawsuit from a network he owed money to, and by the mid-1990s, a man who had once been the highest-paid actor in the world found himself filing for bankruptcy, owing far more than his remaining assets were worth. Even his beloved ranch in Florida, the sprawling property where scenes from some of his most famous films were shot, the place where the petting zoo his son grew up visiting, was eventually lost to foreclosure and sold off as part of his financial unwinding. It was a painful, public unraveling of the very image Burt had spent decades building. Part of what made Burt such a beloved leading man was his refusal to hide behind a stunt double. He wanted audiences to see him actually driving the car through the chase, actually taking the fall, actually living the danger on screen. And for years, that commitment paid off in ticket sales. But it also took a brutal, cumulative toll on his body that fans rarely saw reported at the time. During the filming of one of his defining dramatic roles, he went over a waterfall for a stunt and badly injured his tailbone, an injury that would quietly bother him for the rest of his life. On another film, a fight scene left him with a hernia that required surgery to correct. The worst incident came in the mid-1980s, on the very first day of shooting a new film, when he was struck in the face by a metal chair during a scene. The blow was severe enough to damage his jaw, leaving him with a painful condition that made it difficult to even chew or speak normally. He was put on a liquid diet for weeks and lost a significant amount of weight as a result. To manage the pain, doctors prescribed him medication, and over time Burt found himself dependent on it, a struggle with addiction that stretched on for years before he was able to get past it. He also lived for years with hypoglycemia, a condition causing dangerously low blood sugar, something he spoke about candidly on late-night television at a time when celebrities rarely discuss health issues so openly. In those same interviews, he admitted to struggling with anxiety, a surprising confession from a man whose entire public image was built on effortless confidence. Despite the toll it all took, the stunt community never forgot what Burt had sacrificed for his craft, eventually honoring him years later with a Lifetime Achievement Award named for one of the pioneers of the profession. Despite it all, Burt kept working almost until the end. He'd even signed on for a supporting role in an upcoming Quentin Tarantino film, a comeback of sorts that fans were genuinely excited about. He never got the chance to make it. On September 6, 2018, Burt Reynolds died of a heart attack at a hospital in Florida. He was 82 years old. His passing sent a wave of tributes across the entertainment industry. Old friends, longtime collaborators, and fans who'd grown up watching him spoke about his energy, his humor, and the sheer range of roles he'd tackled across 6 decades in the business. His family kept his memorial small and private. Just close friends and relatives gathered together, a stark contrast to the public spectacle that had followed him for most of his career. Quentin was there. So was Lonnie Anderson. So was Sally Field, the woman Burt had once called the love of his life, decades after their own relationship had ended. Then came the detail that set off a wave of speculation online. When Burt's will became public record, as wills typically do once they pass through probate court, people noticed something jarring. Quentin's name wasn't in it. Not a mention, not a dollar amount, nothing. For a lot of fans, that single detail was enough to build an entire narrative. That father and son must have had a falling out, that something ugly must have happened behind closed doors, that Burt had somehow chosen to cut his only son off in his final act. The truth, once people actually read the document closely, told a very different story. Burt's will included a specific line explaining that he was intentionally leaving Quentin out of it because he had already provided for him elsewhere through a separate legal arrangement known as a living trust. That single clause was the root of all the confusion, and also the key to understanding what Burt had actually done. A living trust works very differently from a will. A will has to go through probate, a court process that becomes part of the public record, meaning anyone can eventually look it up and see exactly who got what. A trust, on the other hand, operates almost entirely in private. Assets placed into a trust bypass the court process altogether, which means faster access for beneficiaries, fewer legal fees, and, critically for a man who has spent his entire adult life in the public eye, total privacy. Burt had set this trust up years before his death, well ahead of when he signed his final will in 2011. All of his major assets were folded into it, with Quentin named as the intended beneficiary, rather than naming his son as executor. Though, Burt made a deliberate choice to hand that responsibility to his niece instead, specifically so that Quentin would never have to deal with the awkward position of managing his own inheritance, while also being the one receiving it. It was, by every account from people who understood the legal structure, a thoughtful and fairly common strategy used by public figures who want to protect their children from exactly the kind of speculation that ended up happening anyway. In the days following Burt's death, as online